John Rawls is arguably the most influential political philosopher of the 20th century. A field that had been dominated by utilitarianism, Rawls reintroduces a Kantian perspective, famously theorizing the idea of justice as fairness. He has an immense following and likewise has an immense number of critics. But in this lecture video, I'm just going to present the basic idea of justice as fairness, largely from his book, A Theory of Justice, although throughout his life there are many changes he made overall to this idea of justice as fairness. Rawls finds himself in the tradition of the social contract theory, right? Emanating from Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, through Kant. Now, of course, Rawls is much more closely related to a more Kantian or Rousseauian account of the social contract theory. Insofar as with Rousseau, we get this idea of the general will, and likewise in Kant, we get this kind of constructivist angle that we'll talk about a little bit later. Social contract theory is either, it can be a moral theory, it can be a political theory. So with social contract theory, it's about morality and the legitimacy of a government arising from a social contract that self-interested and rational people would agree to. So it's about hypothetically. So hypothetically, what would a rational person agree to? So famously, like in the case of Locke. Locke argues someone using reason would see that it's better to live in a state than in the state of nature, because in a state you have your basic rights protected, right? Now we'll see with Rawls, his contractualism is somewhat different. Rawls says, in particular, the content of the relevant agreement is not to enter a given society or to adopt a given form of government, but to accept certain moral principles. Moreover, the undertakings referred to are purely hypothetical. A contract view holds that certain principles would be accepted in a well-defined initial situation. And what's interesting about Rawls's contractualism is the kind of encompassing moralistic nature of it, insofar as it's not just like it's a moral contract like we might find in Scanlon. It's not just that it's a political contract like we might find in Locke, but it's a moral contract for purposes of political life, insofar as how we can have a well-regulated society adhering to principles of justice. Now, even though it's hypothetical, we'll see that for Rawls, his contractualism is objective insofar as it's what people would agree to unanimously given the proper conditions. So we'll see we have this idea of an original position where participants that are going to look at different principles of justice will determine which one could they unanimously agree to. And it's through that agreement that participants actually not only set out an ideal that they say, yeah, this is the ideal of justice, these are the kind of principles that should regulate our society, but by that agreement, it's morally binding insofar as they find it normative, that they ought to abide by those principles of justice. This is akin to what goes on in Kant's Copernican revolution, insofar as for Kant, it's not the case that we passively receive sensory information from the world, but rather that the mind constructs the world as we know it. And yet, it's not subjective, it's objectively the case of how the world is, because it's how our mind rationally construes the world. There's a similar idea here with Rawls's contractualism, that we have an agreement about what the principles of justice would be, and because we unanimously agree to them, it's going to be normatively binding. So it has that kind of objective component of normative force. It's not just subjective that someone can say, well, yeah, I kind of feel that I agree with that principle, or I don't. We just say, well, that's just because it's coming from your perspective. Right? That's not the idea at all with Rawls's contractualism. It is binding. It is universal. For Rawls, justice only arises in certain conditions, and he's influenced by David Hume on this point. So, two conditions under which human cooperation is both possible and necessary according to Rawls. First, that there are objective circumstances which make human cooperation both possible and necessary. That, let's say, we live in a society, right? Cooperation is necessary to live in a society. You couldn't have a kind of, let's say, Hobbesian, war of all against all and have a flourishing society. So you need, if you're going to have let's say, a political constitution, if you're going to have a democracy, you have to make it such that human beings can cooperate, meaning, well, they can't just be the kind of selfish beings that Hobbes, for example, takes them to be. They have to be rationally calculating. Second, there's the conditions of moderate scarcity covering a wide range of situations. So even if humans are rationally calculating, it can't be the case that there are scarce resources. Because if there are scarce resources, then it makes sense for individuals to look out for their own selves first, as opposed to their own selves at the same time of others. So it can't be the case that for justice to hold, we're living in a famine. It's only when there's moderate conditions such that there can be a kind of governing, a regulating of those conditions which make possible human cooperation. So justice is going to concern the basic structure of society. It's going to concern basically the background conditions that make possible our institutions, like our governments, like our marketplaces, like our families, and so on. Justice is the first virtue of institutions. It's what makes them flourish. Rawls says, for us, the primary subject of justice is the basic structure of society, or more exactly, the way in which the major social institutions distribute fundamental rights and duties and determine the division of advantages from social cooperation. By major institutions, he says, I understand the political constitution and the principal economic and social arrangements. So those principles of justice that would be agreed to in a kind of by a contract, there would be the kinds of principles of justice that are going to enable the flourishing, the possibility of these major institutions existing, like the government, like a marketplace, and so on. Because Rawls sees justice as pertaining to these background conditions, it is necessarily the case that in Rawls's methodology, he has to take into account certain relevant facts. And yet, his methodology is not just empirical insofar as it says, well, I'm going to observe how people behave, and then we want to model principles of justice based on the behavior of individuals. The principles of justice in Rawls's methodology, when they're going to be agreed to by individuals unanimously, it's not the case that individuals look at a list of different principles and they deduce, right, what is rationally the best principles to adopt. Rather, there is debate. There is debate in this situation, but it's a rational debate. Rawls says the guiding idea is that the principles of justice for the basic structure of society are the object of the original agreement. They are the principles that free and rational persons concerned to further their own interests would accept in an initial position of equality as defining the fundamental terms of their association. These principles are to regulate all further agreements. So this idea of constructivism is that, well, we don't just derive transcendentally, or in a transcendent fashion, the principles of justice. It's not that they're timeless, that they're universal in the sense of maybe, the basic sense we get from Plato's Republic of the idea of justice. So it's not utopian in this sense. And yet it's also not a kind of like realism insofar as we want to look at how societies operate, and then we say, well, we just want to have a kind of, we want to develop principles of justice that are reflective of kind of natural attitude of individuals. Again, it's this kind of constructivism where we take certain facts about what is basic psychology of human beings? What does basic social theory say about public life, about social existence? We take that into account, aiming at this idea of, okay, how is it that you can have cooperation, that you can have a well-regulated, enduring society? What kind of principles would enable that? So you take into account certain facts from society, but you want to then, through rational discourse, through deliberation, try to agree on what principles could actually enable a well-regulated society. And it's because of that unanimous agreement that whatever principles are chosen are normatively binding. So we'll see what this looks like with the first step. Rawls calls the first step in his methodology the original position. So it's the initial hypothetical situation where rationally interested persons impartially and fairly survey, deliberate, and eventually agree upon a set of principles. So you want to have equal agents. And it actually then reflects, right, that object that we're interested in. So constructivism is not interested at like justice as the thing itself beyond the agreement. It's only interested in justice as the object of agreement. And to some extent, that object of agreement or the circumstances have to reflect what makes that agreement possible. So in the setting where you have individuals come together, it has to be the case that they are all morally equal agents. So in the original position, you don't have persons that deliberate about principles of justice taken as they are in society. So Rawls is not saying actually in the original position, this is how this would actually, this is how individuals, human beings actually would agree upon certain principles of justice. He's saying this is how ideal individuals, ideal agents, those which are morally equal and rationally calculating, this is how they would operate. So then, through the process of deliberation, we have a reflection of what the end result would be, a kind of rational outcome of equality, which is normatively binding. The original position is not enough, though. It can't just be the case that we have morally equal agents that can rationally deliberate, because of human beings are going to be influenced by all sorts of things. Human beings have all sorts of various prejudices and to various degrees. So how then do you mitigate the kind of maybe selfish concerns or any other kinds of influences might result from actual human beings in this hypothetical situation? So what we're interested in the original position, Rawls says, for example, that we're confident that religious intolerance and racial discrimination are unjust. We think that we have examined these things with care and have reached what we believe is an important judgment not likely to be distorted by an excessive attention to our own interests. These convictions are provisional fixed points which we presume any conception of justice must fit. But we have much less assurance as to what is the correct distribution of wealth and authority, for example, right? So here we may be looking for a way to remove our doubts. We can check an interpretation of the initial situation then by the capacity of its principles to accommodate our firmest convictions and to provide guidance where guidance is needed. So we have this issue of pluralism. Societies, right, are pluralistic. There are various individuals, complex beings with various belief systems. Some of them seem to be, perhaps, at least on the surface, incompatible with others. How are you going to get an actual situation where there can be unanimous agreement in the original position? So what Rawls wants to do is show how you can actually have unanimous agreement that doesn't have to dismiss pluralism, but that can actually be the basis of a pluralistic society. How is that possible? Through a veil of ignorance. So the persons that are joined in the original position are to be placed behind what Rawls calls a veil of ignorance, where they do not know how various alternatives of outcomes will affect their own particular case, and where they must evaluate principles solely on the basis of general considerations. As he says, the veil of ignorance makes possible a unanimous choice of a particular conception of justice. Why? Well, let's consider we're debating in the original position and we don't have the veil of ignorance. Let's say we're debating between, I don't know, let's say principles of justice that are more libertarian and principles of justice that are more, egalitarian, let's say. Well, what's going to happen, Rawls thinks, is it's going to be rational that if you're in the original position and you know who you are, and let's say you're a wealthy individual, kind of makes sense that you're going to say, hey, I agree with principles of justice according to a libertarian perspective because it's going to allow me to keep all my wealth. It's going to allow me to continue largely doing the things that I do in my daily life. On the other hand, if you're poorer, a libertarian perspective of principles of justice isn't really going to benefit you. It's not going to allow you to overcome the problems of poverty in the way that perhaps more egalitarian principles of justice that take into or that advocate wealth redistribution might. So it's not clear that we're actually going to have a unanimous agreement in those situations because people are going to be voting on principles of justice, affirming or dismissing various principles of justice based on the knowledge they have from their perspective as they are constituted as individuals in daily life. So behind the veil of ignorance then, if we are denied what sex we are, what race we are, what our class is, what religion we might have, and so on and so forth, all of those kinds of facts, now not all kinds of facts, Rawls thinks we still have kind of basic knowledge of economy, sociology, kind of basic things of how societies work. But we don't know, for example, whether, once the veil of ignorance is lifted, we are black, or white, or gay, or straight, or Christian, or Buddhist, so on and so forth. If we don't know what we actually are in society when the veil of ignorance is lifted, we are going to be rationally calculating all in the same way. And it's going to make sense, for example, that if I don't know what race I might be, I'm probably not going to endorse, principles of justice that are reflective of, say, like a slave society or Jim Crow South, right? I'm likely going to take into account, okay, well, I don't know if I'm rich or poor, so I probably want a system, principles of justice that enable maybe me to better myself economically. But I also don't want it to be the case that it's, all or nothing. That if I, let's say, invest in a company or something like that and I lose all my money, then I kind of am poor and starve, right? Maybe I want like a social safety net or something like that. So we're going to be rationally calculating as these agents, morally equal agents, behind the veil of ignorance. And it's through that we are able to come to unanimous agreement about principles of justice. So what are those principles of justice? Rawls argues what will happen is that there are two principles of justice that will be agreed upon. Now these are lexically ordered, meaning the first is it takes precedence over the second. Now the first principle of justice is what he calls the liberty principle. It says that each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive total system of equal basic liberties compatible with a similar system of liberty for all. So it can't be the case that we would agree to principles of justice where some people have more rights than others. It would have to be the case that everyone has equal rights, right? One person, one vote. Everybody has an equal ability to engage in free speech, so on and so forth. I think that's a pretty intuitive principle. Now, the second one is where things really get interesting. So remember, the first principle, the liberty principle, this is privileged over the second. But the second is actually two sub-principles. So it concerns social and economic inequalities. And the second principle says, first, social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both, and this is according to the difference principle, to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged consistent with the just savings principle. So the difference principle says that it would be unjust to, let's say, pass a law that says we're going to give a tax break only to the 1% and to no one else. Unless it just so happened that through that tax break, it actually benefited more the least advantaged, so the poorest, compared to the 1%. If the greatest advantage goes to the 1% over the poor, then it would be unjust to pass a tax break only for the 1%, for example. Now remember though, it can't be the case then that we can say, well, we can then organize a society according to the difference principle such that perhaps to, enable the greatest benefit to the least advantage to the poor, we have such a massive redistribution of wealth that we make rich people poor now, or something like that, right? That would be, to some extent, violating the liberty principle, because it would be violating a kind of basic access to private property. So it's not that property can't be redistributed, but it can't be redistributed in an arbitrary fashion. So the liberty principle would enable the idea of the right to private property, Rawls thinks, but not private property in the libertarian sense. Private property such that it can be subject to what the difference principle determines. So you can still have access to private property, but not as long as, of course, it might end up that other individuals end up losing rights due to the amount of... So it could be the case sometimes that the amount of private property, the amount of capital you might have, ends up meaning that you have more rights than other individuals. But regardless, the liberty principle is always going to triumph the difference principle, and the difference principle is always going to triumph the equal opportunity principle. The equal opportunity principle says that social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. So it must be the case that every position, government, the CEO of a business, whatever else, has to be open to all individuals. It can't be closed off. Rawls says, thus, the basic structure should allow these inequalities so long as they improve everyone's situation, including that of the least advantaged, provided that they are consistent with equal liberty and fair opportunity. Because the parties start from an equal division of all social primary goods, those who benefit least have, so to speak, a veto. Thus, we arrive at the difference principle, taking equality as the basis of comparison. Those who have gained more must do so on terms that are justifiable to those who have gained the least. And I think we can see why Rawls thinks that, rationally calculating individual would agree to these principles, because they would say, okay, I want to be able to economically, financially better myself, but I don't want to make it the case that, I could be subject to living in poverty if my attempts to financially better myself go wrong. And so we can see where it's the ability for individuals to maybe invest, engage in market activities, but, of course, if engaging in those market activities would hurt the poor get a veto, basically, to say, hey, you can't do that, right? So what we're going to look at then are ways in which we can see Rawls contrasting his principles of justice to those under utilitarianism, utilitarian theory of justice. And we're going to focus on this because that was Rawls's primary enemy, right, when he wrote A Theory of Justice in the 20th century, was utilitarianism. So Rawls says that whereas utilitarianism favors social welfare because of the principle of utility, that we ought to do that which maximizes the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, that would mean that sometimes it might be the case, depending on what kind of utilitarian theory you're working with, you could violate some people's rights in order to maximize overall social welfare. Rawls says, though, justice as fairness prioritizes liberty and right over social welfare. So it is possible, of course, to increase social welfare, and we see this with the difference principle. But it cannot come at the expense of liberty. He says, justice denies that the loss of freedom for some is made right by a greater good shared by others. Insofar as the decision regarding justice for utilitarianism, Rawls thinks, is based on basically this kind of rational, all-knowing being who calculates all the facts in the world and then determines how the world ought to be organized. So he says, where utilitarianism extends to society, the principle of choice for one man, this rational man. For Rawls, justice as fairness assumes that principles of choice are themselves the object of an original agreement. And so we can see the kind of democratic character of justice as fairness, insofar as it's not this kind of rational, objective, God's eye view perspective that determines what justice is, but justice is the product of democratic deliberation. In this way, I think we can see why, again, according to Rawls, the principles under justice as fairness would have more normative force than under utilitarianism, because in justice as fairness, in the original position, it's everyone agreeing to principles, whereas in utilitarianism, no one has to agree to anything. It's just objectively the case, utilitarianism argues. And lastly, we can see just in the kinds of theories that utilitarianism and justice as fairness is. Utilitarianism is a teleological theory. It's based on maximizing the good as the end product. Everything we do is for the sake of the end. But justice as fairness is a deontological theory. It's based on right itself. So right for justice as fairness is prioritized over the good. We already talked about this, but it's about the process of theorizing. So as Rawls says, in justice as fairness, on the other hand, compared to utilitarianism, persons accept in advance a principle of equal liberty, and they do this without a knowledge of their more particular ends. And I think the reason why he's emphasizing this is because, again, in actual society, we have pluralism. So many people have different ends they think are worth pursuing. They have different belief systems. How can you have a theory that can apply and be normatively binding to all individuals when their ends that they see as making their life worthwhile, as they see as constituting the kind of path in life that they were to pursue, are different? So in justice as fairness, the individuals in the original position, Rawls says, implicitly agree, therefore, to conform their conceptions of their good to what the principles of justice require, or at least not to press claims which directly violate them. And here I think we can see the kind of realistic utopianism of Rawls, right? Rawls is setting out a kind of principles of justice that are meant to be binding for all insofar as there's full compliance with the principles of justice, and yet it's still a reflection to some degree of how people really are. That's what's interesting about constructivism. It's in a sense takes information from how people actually are, but puts it into an ideal circumstance that can produce ideal principles of justice that are practically guiding for individuals in the real world. But what do you think? Do you think rational persons would unanimously agree to the two principles of justice Rawls outlines if they actually did enter into the original position? Or do you think another principle or principles would be agreed to in the original position? Has Rawls gotten the actual end result of the original position wrong? Are there other principles of justice that could be unanimously agreed to?